Part 1. The Wreck in Rattlesnake Gorge. What do you do when your only path to a new life lies shattered at the bottom of a canyon, and the stranger who offers salvation might be hiding a truth darker than the shadows around you? Dust hung thick in the air, swirling like ghosts above the splintered remains of the Stagecoach. Rattlesnake Gorge, a jagged scar carved through the Wyoming wilderness, swallowed the echoes of snapping wood and the panicked cries of horses. The sun blazed high, its heat pressing against the canyon walls, indifferent to the chaos below. The coach lay tilted on its side, one wheel spinning lazily in the dry air, as if mocking the stillness of the scene. Inside, 5 women disentangled themselves from the wreckage, their breaths ragged, their dresses torn. Outside, the driver's body sprawled lifeless beside the spooked team, his hat tumbled into the dirt. They had been traveling for weeks, each clutching a contract that bound her to a stranger in a town called Hope's End, a mining settlement promising prosperity in the heart of the frontier. These were not women of wealth or privilege, but of necessity, driven west by dreams of stability or escape from lives that had left them no other choice. As the dust settled, Clara Thornton, the eldest at 28, pulled herself through the shattered window, her gloved hands gripping the splintered frame. Her dark eyes scanned the endless twists of the canyon, its paths snaking into shadow, each one indistinguishable from the next. Fear coiled in her chest, not just for their survival, but for what awaited them if they ever reached Hope's End. High above, a silhouette appeared on the canyon rim, a man, his face weathered by years under the unrelenting sun, his eyes sharp as they traced the maze below. He moved with the ease of someone who knew every crevice of this unforgiving land. Clara's heart leapt, then faltered. Was he their savior, or something else entirely? She couldn't know that this stranger, Jonah Caldwell, carried secrets about Hope's End that would unravel everything they thought they were chasing. April 1876, Philadelphia. Clara Thornton folded her last dress into a battered trunk, her fingers lingering on the worn cotton, its stitches a reminder of better days. At 28, she had long accepted the label of spinster, her prospects dimmed by a society that valued women for youth and compliance. But then the advertisement had appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer: brides wanted for Hope's End, Wyoming. Passage paid. Security guaranteed. It was a lifeline, however uncertain. Her job as a schoolteacher had ended abruptly when the academy's head mistress deemed her ideas, education for women beyond domestic arts, too radical. With her father gone and their small home sold to cover his debts, Clara had no anchor left in the East. "You're signing away your freedom," Mr. Hargrove, the recruitment agent, had warned, his voice flat as he pushed the contract across his desk. His heavy jowls quivered slightly, betraying no sympathy. "Hope's End needs wives to stabilize its miners and merchants. The journey's grueling, but you'll have a home." A home. The word lingered in Clara's mind as she snapped the trunk shut. She had traded her independence for a promise, a marriage to a man named Samuel Hayes, a general store owner in a town too new to appear on most maps. It wasn't love she sought, but survival, a chance to build something from the ashes of her old life. The Stagecoach station buzzed with early morning chaos as Clara arrived, her trunk dragged behind her. 4 other women already stood beside a gleaming Concorde coach, its red paint catching the dawn light. A burly driver lashed luggage to the roof while his young assistant, Nate, checked the harnesses of 6 sturdy horses. "Name," the station agent barked, barely glancing up from his ledger. "Clara Thornton, bound for Hope's End," she replied, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. He scratched a mark on his paper. "Last one. Get on." Clara approached the group, noting the tension in their postures, the way their eyes avoided one another. The youngest, barely 17, clutched a handkerchief, her blonde curls framing a face still soft with youth. Clara extended a hand, her teacher's instinct kicking in. "I'm Clara. Looks like we're in this together." The girl's eyes brightened with relief. "Lillian Carter," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm to marry Daniel Walsh, a minor with his own claim." The words sounded rehearsed, as if she'd been reciting them to bolster her courage. A tall woman with auburn hair, pinned tightly beneath a no-nonsense bonnet, stepped forward. "Margaret Kane," she said, her tone clipped, her green eyes daring anyone to challenge her. "Let's not pretend this is a grand adventure. We're here because we had no better options." "I see it as a transaction," said another, her voice soft but firm, her blue traveling dress hinting at a refinement not entirely lost. "Abigail Harper. I aim to be Hope's End's doctor." Her southern drawl carried the weight of a past she didn't volunteer. The fifth woman stood apart, her dark hair and olive skin setting her apart from the others. Her brown dress was simple but well-crafted, her posture defiant. Noticing their attention, she straightened. "Isabel Delgado," she said, her voice steady. "My father was Mexican, my mother from New York. And yes, my contract's with the saloon owner, Caleb Vaughn." Her chin lifted, ready to deflect judgment. Clara nodded, acknowledging each without prying. They were strangers, bound by a shared leap into the unknown, each carrying her own burdens. "All aboard," the driver shouted, his voice cutting through the morning clamor. "We're losing daylight." The women climbed into the coach, arranging skirts and bags in the cramped space. Clara sat between Lillian and Abigail, with Margaret and Isabel across from her. As the coach lurched forward, they gripped the leather straps dangling from the ceiling. "2 weeks to Hope's End, ladies," the driver called through the window. "Barring storms or bad luck." The first few days passed in near silence, the only sounds the creak of the coach and the driver's occasional commands to the horses. They stopped at way stations for fresh teams and hurried meals, beans, hard bread, weak coffee. Nights were spent in cramped rooms on narrow cots, too exhausted for talk. But on the fourth night, as they gathered around a flickering fire at a remote station, Lillian's resolve cracked. "I can't do this," she whispered, tears spilling over. "I don't even know what he looks like." Abigail reached for her hand, her touch gentle. "My first marriage was arranged when I was 16, she said, her voice low. "He was twice my age, reeked of bourbon. Died in the war. This time I chose for myself." "Choice?" Margaret scoffed, poking at the fire. "What choice is there when the world leaves you no way to survive? I taught piano until the school folded. Now I'll play hymns in a frontier chapel and share a miner's bed." Clara stared into the flames, her own reasons crystallizing. "We can shape our fate," she said finally. "These men need us as much as we need them. That gives us leverage if we're smart." Isabel's laugh was sharp, almost musical. "I like you, Clara. You think like a strategist." She pulled a small flask from her bag, the silver glinting in the firelight. "Anyone need a little courage." By the time they reached the Wyoming territories, a fragile bond had formed. They shared stories in hushed tones as the landscape shifted, Philadelphia's cobblestones giving way to rolling prairies, then the stark beauty of the foothills. "We'll take Rattlesnake Gorge," the driver announced one morning as they left a tiny settlement of 3 shacks. "Cuts 2 days off the trip to Hope's End." "Is it safe?" Abigail asked, peering at the increasingly barren terrain. Nate, the driver's assistant, answered, his voice quiet. "Safe enough if you know the way. Walls climb 100 feet in places, narrow enough to touch both sides. Clara noticed Nate's gaze linger on Lillian, a softness there he tried to hide. The girl had stopped crying days ago, but her handkerchief remained a constant in her hands, a talisman against the unknown. As they entered the gorge, the air grew cooler, the towering rock walls casting them in shadow. The road shrank to a treacherous path, hugging the cliff with a steep drop to a shallow stream below. "Look," Isabel pointed upward, where faint carvings marked the stone. "Native symbols." "Old ones," Nate confirmed. "This canyon's sacred to some tribes. Folks say it's haunted." Margaret rolled her eyes. "Ghost stories for children." The coach jolted suddenly, a horse rearing at some unseen threat. The driver cursed, wrestling the reins. Clara gripped the strap as they veered toward the edge, her heart pounding. "Hold steady," the driver shouted. Then came the sickening crack of wood, and the world tilted. Clara was thrown against Abigail, glass shattering around them. Someone screamed, "Lillian, maybe." The coach slid, crashing onto the canyon floor in a storm of dust and splintered timber. When the chaos stopped, Clara found herself pinned beneath Margaret's legs, Lillian's weight against her shoulder. Sunlight streamed through the broken window above them, illuminating the wreckage. "Is everyone alive?" Clara called, her voice hoarse as she assessed her own injuries, bruises, a sore wrist, nothing broken. One by one they answered. Lillian had a gash above her eye, blood streaking her face. Abigail's arm hung at an odd angle, her face pale with pain. Margaret, miraculously, had only scratches. Isabel pressed a cloth to a cut on her forehead, her jaw set. "We need to get out," Margaret said, already climbing toward the window. They helped Abigail, wincing as she moved her injured arm, and emerged into the harsh daylight. The scene was grim. The driver lay dead, his neck twisted unnaturally. Nate was gone, perhaps thrown clear or fled. The horses, still tethered to the broken axle, thrashed in panic. Clara scrambled to higher ground, desperate for a sense of direction. The canyon stretched endlessly, its walls sheer and unforgiving. Which way to Hope's End? Which way to anywhere? She had no answers. Then she saw him, a lone figure on the canyon rim watching. "Hello," she shouted, waving her arms. "We need help." The man vanished, and Clara's hope faltered. Had he abandoned them? Minutes later, he reappeared, descending a hidden path with the surefootedness of a mountain goat. As he drew closer, she saw his buckskin clothes, worn smooth by years of use, a rifle slung across his back. His face was tanned, his blue eyes startling against the rugged lines of his skin. "Ladies," he said, tipping his hat, his voice rough from disuse. "Looks like you've hit a rough patch. Name's Jonah Caldwell." Clara stepped forward, her teacher's poise masking her exhaustion. "We're grateful, Mr. Caldwell. Our driver's dead and we're lost. We were headed to Hope's End." At the mention of the town, something flickered in Jonah's eyes, guarded, almost wary. "Hope's End," he repeated, the words heavy. "That's 3 days' walk if you know the path." He glanced at their torn dresses, Abigail's sling-bound arm, the scattered supplies. "Which you don't." "You know the way?" Isabel asked, stepping beside Clara, her tone sharp with hope. Jonah's gaze swept over them, unreadable. "I've lived in this canyon 7 years. Know it better than most." He paused, then nodded, as if deciding something. "I can get you there, but not tonight. We'll camp and move at first light." As he turned to calm the horses, Margaret leaned close to Clara. "Can we trust him?" she whispered. Clara watched Jonah's careful movements, his hands steady as he soothed the animals. "What choice do we have?" she replied softly. What none of them knew then was that Jonah Caldwell wasn't just a hermit who knew the canyon. He knew Hope's End, its promises, its betrayals, and the graves it hid. And as the sun dipped below the canyon rim, casting long shadows across the wreckage, he made a silent vow. These women would not become another secret buried in the dust. Part 2. Shadows of the Gorge. In the heart of Rattlesnake Gorge, where the canyon walls whisper secrets older than the stones, 5 women must decide whether to trust a stranger whose eyes hold more grief than hope. The canyon darkened as the sun sank, its last rays painting the jagged walls of Rattlesnake Gorge in hues of blood and gold. Jonah Caldwell worked with quiet efficiency, salvaging what he could from the wrecked stagecoach. He freed the trembling horses, their eyes wild with fear, and tethered them to a gnarled juniper. From the splintered remains, he gathered blankets, a dented canteen, and a sack of cornmeal, his hands moving with the practiced ease of a man who had long survived on little. For Abigail Harper's injured arm, he fashioned a splint from broken coach wood and strips of leather torn from the upholstery, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. "It's not broken clean through," he said, his voice low as he secured the makeshift brace. "But it needs a proper doctor in a town that's not Hope's End." Abigail nodded, her face pale, though her eyes held a stubborn resolve. "I've weathered worse," she murmured, glancing at Clara Thornton, who understood the weight behind those words. While Jonah tended to Abigail, the others scoured the wreckage for their belongings. Clara found her journal, its leather cover scuffed but intact, wedged beneath a boulder. She slipped it into her pocket alongside the crumpled contract binding her to Samuel Hayes, a man she'd never met. The paper felt heavier now, a reminder of the gamble she'd taken. Lillian Carter, her hands trembling, suggested burying the driver, her voice cracking as she glanced at his still form, now covered with a tattered blanket. Jonah shook his head, his eyes scanning the darkening sky. "Ground's too hard here. We'll pile stones over him. It's the best we can do." He pointed to a sheltered alcove a quarter-mile ahead, where a freshwater spring bubbled from the rock. "We need to make camp before nightfall. Cougars prowl these parts." Margaret Kane, standing apart with her arms crossed, fixed Jonah with a skeptical stare. "And you just happened to be here, Mr. Caldwell, right when we needed rescuing." Her tone was sharp, honed by years of distrust. Jonah finished securing Abigail's splint before answering, his gaze meeting Margaret's without flinching. "I was tracking a mountain lion that's been raiding my traps." Heard the crash. His voice carried a weight that suggested he'd seen too many wrecks in this canyon. "Most don't walk away from accidents in Rattlesnake Gorge." "You're lucky." "Lucky?" Isabel Delgado's laugh was bitter, her dark eyes flashing as she clutched a small carpet bag, its contents all that remained of her worldly possessions. 5 women stranded in the middle of nowhere doesn't feel like fortune. Jonah stood, dusting his hands on his buckskin pants. "You're breathing." "That's more than most who have crossed this path." His words held a quiet authority, tinged with something personal, loss perhaps, or regret. Clara stepped closer, sensing layers to Jonah's story he wasn't sharing. "You said you've lived here 7 years. Alone?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. His expression tightened, a shadow crossing his weathered face. "Mostly. Hope's End is the closest town, but I don't visit much anymore." "Why not?" Clara pressed, navigating around a fallen rock as they began preparing to move. Jonah hefted his rifle, his eyes scanning the canyon walls. "We need to move before dark. Cougars aren't the only threat out here." He deflected her question, pointing to the small bundles of salvaged supplies. "Carry what you can. Stay close. The path narrows." They worked in silence, assembling a makeshift travois for Abigail using a blanket stretched between 2 sturdy branches. Margaret and Isabel took the first shift pulling it, while Lillian gathered the remaining food, a sack of cornmeal, some jerky, and a few cans of peaches. Clara found herself walking beside Jonah as they set out, the others trailing behind. His stride was steady, his eyes constantly roving the terrain, alert for danger. "You didn't answer my question," Clara said quietly after a few minutes, her boots crunching on the gravel path. "Why avoid Hope's End?" Jonah glanced at her, his expression guarded. "Didn't realize I was under interrogation, Miss Thornton." "Not interrogation. Curiosity." She sidestepped a jutting rock, her voice calm but insistent. 5 women heading to marry strangers might benefit from knowing what they are walking into. He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't respond. Then, his voice low enough that the others couldn't hear, he spoke. "Hope's End isn't the shining promise its name suggests. Not anymore. The silver vein that built the town is drying up. The men are desperate, clinging to dreams of a big strike. They bring in brides to give them something to stay for, to keep them digging." Clara's stomach tightened, but she kept her tone even. "And the women? What happens to them?" Jonah adjusted his rifle strap, his jaw tightening. 3 years ago, they brought in a dozen brides. Within a year, 5 were dead. His words landed like stones, heavy and cold. Clara stopped walking, her breath catching. "How?" "Mining accidents took 3 husbands, leaving widows who didn't last long. One woman couldn't bear the isolation, walked into a snowstorm and never came back. Another," he hesitated, his voice dropping lower. "Her death was called an accident, but there were whispers." Clara's mind raced, connecting his reluctance to his earlier wariness. "You know this because it was personal, don't you?" His eyes met hers, raw with old pain. "My sister, Rachel, was one of them. Married to the town assayer, Henry Vaughan. 6 months later she was gone, fell down a mine shaft, they said. Buried before I could even see her." Clara absorbed the weight of his words, her teacher's mind piecing together the implications. "You don't believe it was an accident?" "I know it wasn't." His voice hardened, but he kept it low. "But a lone man can't prove anything against a town that protects its own. I left Hope's End, not to hide but to watch. This canyon gives me eyes on everything moving in or out." "Including stagecoaches full of brides," Clara said, understanding dawning. Jonah nodded, his expression grim. "Yours is the 3rd group in 2 years. I've been tracking the pattern, waiting for a chance to act. Why not stop the coaches before they reach town? Warn people away. And say what?" His voice was bitter. "That I've got suspicions but no proof. That I'm a grieving brother seeing ghosts where there might be none." He shook his head. "I needed evidence. And now I've got a bigger problem. 5 women, 1 injured, stranded in a canyon with no clear way out." Clara considered his words, her mind already turning over possibilities. "These men were contracted to marry. Do you know them?" "Some." Jonah's tone darkened. "Samuel Hayes, your intended, runs the general store. Decent enough, but he's been drowning in whiskey since his claim went bust. Daniel Walsh, the kid's match, is barely 22, working a worthless claim. Abigail's doctor, Benjamin Cole, is the town physician, but his hands shake from laudanum. Can't stitch a wound without a bottle nearby." Clara's chest tightened, but she pressed on. "Margaret's husband, Robert Ellison, church deacon. Widowed twice, both wives dead of fever, or so he claims. And Isabel's." Clara's voice was barely a whisper now. "Caleb Vaughan, saloon owner. His place does more business in back rooms than at the bar, if you catch my meaning." Jonah's eyes flicked to Clara's, ensuring she understood the grim fate awaiting Isabel. We need to tell the others, Clara said, her resolve hardening. Not yet, Jonah cautioned. Those contracts are ironclad. Until we reach a town with real authorities, running could brand you outlaws. Hope's End has a sheriff, and he's in the mine owner's pocket. So what do you suggest? Clara asked, frustration creeping into her voice. Before Jonah could answer, Lillian's voice called from behind. Mr. Caldwell. Abigail's fading, she needs to rest. They halted in a small clearing where the canyon widened, the walls rising like silent sentinels. Abigail insisted she could continue, but her face had taken on a sickly pallor that worried Clara. Jonah checked the splint, then pulled a small pouch from his belt. Willow bark, he said, handing Abigail a few strips. Chew it. Eases the pain. As the women settled to rest, Jonah pulled Clara aside, his voice low. We'll reach my cabin by nightfall. It's hidden, defensible with supplies. We can talk more there. Will they come looking for us from Hope's End? Clara asked, her eyes flicking to the canyon rim. When the stage doesn't arrive, they'll send a search party. But this gorge is a labyrinth. They won't find us easily. He glanced at the sky, now streaked with clouds. We need to move soon. There's worse than cougars out here. Clara opened her mouth to ask what he meant when a faint sound stopped her, a rhythmic thudding, like hooves echoing through the canyon. What's that? She whispered, her heart racing. Jonah's posture shifted, suddenly alert. Everyone up, he barked, all trace of calm gone. Riders, at least 3 moving fast. Clara hurried to help with the travois as Margaret and Isabel lifted it. Lillian gathered their meager supplies, her hands shaking. From Hope's End? Clara asked, her voice tight. No. Different direction. Jonah's face was grim. Likely Apache. A small band hunts these canyons. They're not always hostile, but tensions with settlers have been high. They won't take kindly to strangers. They moved as fast as Abigail's injury allowed, Jonah leading them through narrowing passages where the canyon walls seemed to close in. The hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped abruptly. They are on foot now, Jonah whispered, ushering them beneath an overhanging ledge. Stay here. Don't move. Before Clara could protest, he vanished around a bend, his movements silent as a shadow. The women huddled in the growing darkness, each lost in her thoughts. Lillian whispered, I never should have signed that contract. My stepfather practically forced me. He wanted me gone. Margaret's sharp edges softened slightly. We all had reasons, girl. My father gambled away our home. The church took us in, but their charity came with strings, endless work, and a deacon who couldn't keep his hands to himself. When the agent came through, it felt like a way out. My husband died at Gettysburg, Abigail said, her voice barely audible. His family blamed me for not giving him a son. Turned me out. I nursed soldiers during the war, thought a frontier doctor might value that, unlike the city men who laughed me off. Isabel leaned against the cold stone, her dark eyes catching the faint light. My mother died when I was 14. My father tried, but a half-Mexican daughter was a scandal in New York's high society. When he passed, his family made it clear I wasn't theirs. It was the factory or the streets until this. Clara listened, recognizing the thread that bound them. Women cast out by a world that saw no value in them beyond marriage or motherhood. We chose Hope's End because it was better than what we left, she said softly. But now what? Before anyone could answer, a low whistle cut through the darkness. Jonah reappeared, moving with the same silent grace. They've split up searching the side canyons, he whispered. We've got maybe 30 minutes before they find our trail. My cabin's a mile off. Can we make it? Not all together, Margaret said, eyeing the travois. They'll hear us. Jonah's eyes met Clara's in the dim light. I need to create a diversion. What kind? Clara asked, dread pooling in her stomach. The kind that pulls them away from you. He pressed a small leather pouch into her hand. This has a map to my cabin. Follow the dry creek bed until you see 3 standing stones. Then head east up a narrow trail. The cabin's in a box canyon. Bar the door when you get there. You expect us to navigate in the dark with Abigail injured, Margaret protested. There's a half-moon rising. It'll be enough once your eyes adjust. Jonah turned to Clara. Keep them moving. No matter what you hear, don't stop. Clara gripped his arm, her voice urgent. And you? What will you do? Make sure those trackers follow me. He checked his rifle, then handed her a pistol from his boot. 6 shots. Use it only if you have to. The sound might scare off trouble. I've never fired a gun, Clara admitted, the weapon heavy in her hand. Point and pull the trigger. Trust your instincts. He looked at each woman, his gaze steady. Stay together. I'll find you by morning if I can. Before they could argue, he melted into the shadows. Moments later, a shout echoed from the opposite direction, followed by the clatter of falling rocks. He's drawing them away, Clara realized. We move now. They emerged from the ledge, Clara leading with Jonah's map clutched tightly. Margaret and Isabel managed the travois, while Lillian carried their supplies. The rising moon cast a silver glow, turning the canyon into a world of stark contrasts, deep shadows and ghostly highlights. Their progress was agonizingly slow, Abigail's pain evident in every jolt of the travois. Twice they backtracked when the path grew too narrow for the stretcher. In the distance, shouts and a single rifle shot cracked through the air, each sound tightening the knot in Clara's chest. We should have stayed together, Lillian fretted during a brief pause, her voice barely above a whisper. What if he's hurt? He knows this land, Clara said, though her own fears echoed Lillian's. We have to trust him. Trust a man we met hours ago. Margaret's voice was sharp, but there was fear beneath it. For all we know, he's leading us into a trap. Isabel, quieter than usual, raised a hand for silence. Listen, she whispered. Clara strained her ears, hearing nothing at first but the wind's soft moan. Then it came, the faint trickle of water over rocks. The creek bed, she said, checking Jonah's map. We're close. With renewed urgency, they pressed on, following the sound until the canyon opened slightly, revealing a shallow stream bed where moonlight glinted off small pools. They traced it for what felt like hours until Clara spotted them, 3 tall stones, standing like silent guardians against the canyon wall. East from here, she said, orienting herself by the stars, a skill her father had taught her long ago. A narrow trail, barely visible, climbed the canyon wall. Abigail eyed the steep ascent with dread. I can't make that. We'll carry you, Clara said firmly. Margaret, Isabel, we'll lift her together. Lillian, take the supplies. The climb was brutal. They abandoned the travois, linking arms to form a seat for Abigail. Loose shale slipped beneath their feet, and Clara's arms burned with the effort. She could hear the others' labored breathing, but no one complained. Inch by inch they ascended. At the top, a small box canyon opened before them, hidden from the main gorge. Against the far wall stood Jonah's cabin, its log walls weathered but sturdy, its windows dark. They half-carried Abigail the final distance, collapsing against the heavy door. Inside, the cabin was sparse but orderly. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, shelves stocked with dried goods, a single bed in the corner. Jonah lived simply, but every item spoke of survival. Clara found a tinderbox and lit a lantern, its warm glow revealing the room's quiet resilience. "Look for medical supplies," Clara instructed, helping Abigail to the bed. "Jonah must have something for wounds." Isabel found a wooden chest containing bandages, dried herbs, and bottles of clear liquid. "Moonshine," she said, sniffing one. "Strong enough to clean cuts." They redressed Abigail's arm, gave her a sip of the liquor to dull the pain, and made her as comfortable as possible. Lillian found dried venison and beans, preparing a simple meal over the fire, while Margaret barred the door and shuttered the window. As the others ate, Clara stood by the window, peering into the moonlit canyon. Somewhere out there, Jonah was risking his life for them. But why? Was it compassion, or did he have an agenda tied to his sister's death? Her gaze drifted to a small desk in the corner, its surface bare except for a leather-bound journal. Curiosity battled her conscience, but the need for answers won. Glancing to ensure the others were occupied, she crossed to the desk and opened the journal to its latest entry, dated 3 days prior. Jonah's handwriting was precise, almost scholarly, a stark contrast to his rugged appearance. April 17, 1876. Scouts report another stagecoach of brides due. 5 this time, matching the pattern. 3 years of watching confirm what I've feared. The deaths aren't accidents. Hope's End is crumbling, and its men are desperate. The mine's investors demand results, so the council feeds them lies. Brides keep the miners tethered, but when the women see through the deception, they become threats. I've mapped 12 graves in 3 years, only 4 marked. The rest are hidden in the canyon walls. This has to stop. I have names, dates, suspicions, but no proof a judge would accept. The sheriff's complicit, the council's untouchable, and my letters to the governor go unanswered. There's only one way left, one I've dodged too long out of fear. Hope's End must be exposed, and I'm the only one who can do it. Clara closed the journal, her pulse racing. What had Jonah planned? And how did their crash fit into his mission? Before she could process further, a sharp knock at the door jolted them all. "It's Caldwell," came Jonah's low voice. "I'm alone." Margaret, gripping the pistol Jonah had given Clara, moved cautiously to the door. "Prove it's you," she demanded. The driver was Amos. His assistant, Nate, had eyes for the blonde girl. "I gave Miss Thornton willow bark and a pistol with 6 shots, which you're now holding." His voice carried a trace of exasperation. "Open the door before those trackers find us." Margaret unbarred the door, and Jonah slipped inside, securing it behind him. His buckskin shirt was torn, a bloody gash visible on his shoulder. Exhaustion lined his face, but he was unharmed otherwise. "You're hurt," Lillian said, reaching for the medical supplies. "Just a scrape from a rock, not a bullet." Jonah's eyes swept the cabin, noting their efforts, the fire, the food, Abigail resting. "You did well." His gaze landed on Clara, still near the desk, and a flicker in his expression told her he knew she'd read his journal. "We need to talk, Mr. Caldwell," Clara said evenly, meeting his eyes. "About Hope's End, your sister Rachel, and what you intend to do with 5 women who were never meant to reach that town." Part 3. The Truth in the Firelight. When the flames cast shadows that seemed to whisper of betrayal, how do you trust a man whose grief might lead you to salvation, or straight into a trap? The air in Jonah Caldwell's cabin grew heavy with unspoken questions, as Clara Thornton's words hung between them. The lantern's glow flickered across the rough log walls, casting long shadows that danced like specters of the past. Outside, the wind howled through Rattlesnake Gorge, its mournful wail slipping through the cabin's cracks, as if the canyon itself were warning them. Jonah's gaze shifted from Clara to the open journal on his desk, his weathered face unreadable, though a muscle in his jaw twitched with restrained emotion. "You've been digging into my secrets, Miss Thornton," he said, his voice low and measured, neither accusing nor defensive. The other women, Margaret Kane, Isabel Delgado, Lillian Carter, and Abigail Harper, exchanged wary glances, their makeshift meal forgotten. Margaret, still gripping the pistol, stepped closer, her green eyes narrowing. "She found something, didn't she?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp. "Something about why you're really out here playing savior." Jonah ignored her, crossing to check on Abigail, who stirred restlessly on the narrow bed. He examined her splint with practiced care, then retrieved a small tin from a shelf above the fireplace. "Arnica salve," he explained, mixing the dried herb with a dab of bear grease. "For the swelling." His movements were deliberate, but Clara sensed he was stalling, weighing how much to reveal. "Stop dodging," Clara pressed, stepping into his line of sight. "Your journal talks about graves, suspicions, and exposing hope's end. We're not fools, Mr. Caldwell. If we're walking into danger, we deserve the truth." Isabel rose from her seat by the fire, her dark eyes flashing with urgency. "What graves? What's waiting for us in that town?" Jonah finished applying the salve to Abigail's arm, his shoulders tensing as he straightened. He faced them, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight, and seemed to reach a decision. "You want the truth. Sit down. It's not a short tale." The women gathered around the small table, the fire's crackle the only sound as Jonah stoked the flames, adding a log from the neat stack beside the hearth. His weathered face looked older in the shifting light, carved by years of solitude and loss. He began to speak, his voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. "Hope's End sprang up 8 years ago, when silver was found in these mountains. It grew fast. Hundreds of men poured in, staking claims, building shacks that turned into saloons, a church, a bank. My sister Rachel and I came west in '68, after our folks died in a cholera outbreak back east. I worked the mines while she kept books for the assayer's office." He paused, staring into the fire as if seeing those early days. "For 2 years, the silver flowed like a river. The town thrived. Rachel married Henry Vaughn, the assayer, in the spring of '71. That's when the cracks started showing. The silver was running out," Clara guessed, recalling Jonah's earlier words about the mine's decline. Jonah nodded, his expression grim. "The main vein was deeper than they thought, harder to reach. Costs climbed, profits sank. The Eastern investors got skittish, threatening to pull their money. That's when the town council, mine owner, banker, a few big merchants, cooked up their plan." "What plan?" Lillian asked, her young face pale but attentive, her handkerchief twisted tightly in her hands. "They needed the miners to stay, to keep digging despite the dwindling returns. So they started recruiting brides, women to give the men roots, reasons to believe Hope's End still had a future." Jonah's voice hardened. "The first group arrived in '71. Rachel noticed things didn't add up. She had access to the assayer's records, production reports, shipment logs. She saw the numbers were being fudged, the mine's output inflated to keep investors happy." Margaret leaned forward, her skepticism tempered by curiosity. "That's fraud, but it's not murder." "The murder came later," Jonah said, his tone cold. "When the brides started asking questions, why their husbands worked longer for less, why the town's wealth seemed to flow only to the council. Rachel was the worst thorn in their side. She was smart, relentless. She wrote to me about it while I was out on a distant claim." He crossed to a loose floorboard near the bed, prying it up to reveal a small metal box. From it, he pulled a folded letter, its edges worn from years of handling. "This is the last thing Rachel sent me," he said, unfolding it with care. "It reached me the day after I heard she was dead." He handed it to Clara, who took it as if it were fragile as glass. Rachel's handwriting was neat but hurried, the ink smudged in places, as if written in a rush. "Dearest Jonah, I pray this finds you before they find me. The mine's reports are lies. There's barely any silver left, not enough to justify the operation. The investors are being swindled, and the miners kept in the dark. Henry knows I've seen the real figures. We fought and he hit me, first time he's ever done that. I think he's told the council. 3 women died this year, all married to men who questioned the mine's future. All accidents, they say, but I don't believe it. If something happens to me, don't trust their story. Check the old Carson shaft behind the West claim. That's where they hide their secrets." The letter ended abruptly, the final words trailing into a shaky scrawl. "She didn't finish it," Jonah said quietly. 2 days later, she supposedly fell down a mine shaft while visiting Henry's office. Her body was too mangled to view, buried before I could get back to town. Neat and tidy. A heavy silence settled over the cabin. Even Margaret, usually quick with a retort, looked shaken. "What did she mean about the Carson shaft?" Isabel asked, breaking the quiet. Jonah retrieved several folded papers from the box, rough maps marked with dates and names. "I've spent 3 years tracking it down. The Carson shaft, abandoned years ago, holds at least 8 unmarked graves. Women who asked too many questions, men who threatened to expose the fraud, even a territorial inspector who showed up unannounced." He spread the maps on the table, his finger tracing the locations. "But proving it's another matter. The council controls the town, sheriff, doctor, telegraph operator, all on their payroll. I've written to the territorial governor, but without hard evidence, it's just a hermit's ravings." "So you've been watching, waiting," Lillian said, her voice soft with understanding. "That's why you live out here. And doing nothing while more women are brought in to prop up the lie," Jonah said, his voice thick with self-reproach. "Your Stagecoach is the 3rd group in 2 years. What happened to the others?" Margaret asked, her tone cautious, as if bracing for the answer. "First group, 6 women. 2 lost husbands in mine collapses, widowed within months. 1 vanished in a blizzard. The others are still there, but one so deep in laudanum she barely speaks." Jonah hesitated, choosing his words. "The second group, 4 women, arrived last spring. 1 died of fever, or so they claimed. 1 ran off, never found. The last 2, they've adapted but at a cost." The implications sank in, heavy as the canyon walls. Isabel voiced the fear they all felt. "And now us. 5 more brides to keep the charade going until the mine collapses or the investors catch on." "Then Hope's End becomes a ghost town," Jonah confirmed, its secrets buried with the dead. Abigail, who had roused during the conversation, pushed herself up on her good arm, her face drawn but determined. "So we were never meant to have real marriages, just distractions for desperate men. Some of the men might want wives," Jonah allowed. "But they're caught in a machine that chews up anyone who threatens it. When the truth gets too close, the council doesn't hesitate." Clara's mind churned, piecing together Jonah's journal and his story. "You wrote about a solution, something you'd avoided. What were you planning before our coach crashed?" Jonah ran a hand through his shaggy hair, his expression troubled. "I was going to intercept your stage before it reached Hope's End, warn you off, then use your statements to force a territorial investigation. A long shot, but it was all I had. That needed our cooperation," Margaret noted, her eyes narrowing. "And now?" "Now," Jonah gestured to Abigail's arm, the meager supplies, the women's weary faces. You need a doctor who isn't drowning in opium. You need safe passage out of this territory, past Hope's End, and the Apache band hunting these canyons. The nearest safe town is Fort Benton, 3 days hard travel northwest, but I don't have the horses or supplies for that. A thoughtful silence fell, broken only by the fire's crackle. Lillian, who had been quiet, straightened suddenly. What about Nate, the driver's assistant? He wasn't at the crash site. Jonah nodded, his brow furrowing. Either thrown clear and wandered off, or he made it to Hope's End for help. If he reached town, they know about the crash, Isabel said, urgency creeping into her voice. They could be coming for us. They will, Jonah agreed, his tone grim. But the Apache presence will slow them. They won't risk a night search through the gorge. Clara studied the maps on the table, Jonah's meticulous notes on Hope's End's layout, the mine workings, the hidden graves. An idea sparked, bold and dangerous. What if we didn't avoid Hope's End? She said slowly. What if we used this to get the evidence you need? Margaret scoffed, crossing her arms. You want us to walk into a town that murders women for asking questions. Not as victims, Clara countered, her voice steady. As investigators. They're expecting 5 brides. We show up, tell them about the crash, act eager to meet our husbands. They'll have no reason to suspect we know their secrets. Isabel leaned forward, intrigued despite herself. We could search for Rachel's records, the real mine reports. It's too risky, Jonah said firmly. I won't let you be bait. Not bait, Clara insisted. A chance to end this. How many more women will come after us? How many more graves will you map from this canyon? Her words struck deep, and Jonah's expression wavered, torn between fear for their safety and the truth in her argument. Even if I agreed, he said slowly, how would you share what you find? They'll watch your every move. I'm to marry the deacon, Margaret said, surprising them with her support. The church is often left unlocked for prayer. It could be a meeting point. Clara nodded, building on the idea. And I'll be with the doctor, Abigail added weakly from the bed. His office likely has death records, causes of death. Lillian twisted her handkerchief, her voice small. My Daniel's just a miner. What could I find? Miners talk, Jonah said, warming to the plan despite himself. Especially to a young wife bringing lunch to the dig site. You'd hear things no one else could. And Isabel, Clara said, turning to her. The saloons where men let their guard down, drinking, boasting, spilling secrets. Isabel's smile was sharp, defiant. I've handled worse than frontier drunks in New York's backrooms. I can manage. Jonah shook his head, but his resistance was fading. It's still madness. If they suspect anything, we'll need a signal, Clara cut in, her mind racing. Something to call for help if things go wrong. The church bell, Margaret suggested. 3 rings, pause, 3 more. Not a normal pattern. I could stay close to town, Jonah conceded reluctantly. Near enough to hear the signal. We need a time limit, Isabel added. How long to search before we leave, evidence or not? The stage was due today, Jonah calculated. If Nate made it to Hope's End, they'll send a search party tomorrow. Allow a day to find you and get back. 3 days for investigating seems feasible. Longer and you're begging for trouble. Abigail struggled to sit up, her voice firm despite her pain. And if we find nothing in 3 days, we escape. We can't stay forever. Through the mines, Isabel suggested suddenly. You said the Carson shaft hides graves. Does it connect to other tunnels? Jonah's eyes widened slightly, as if the idea hadn't occurred to him. Yes, it was one of the first dug, links to the main shaft via a crosscut. Officially sealed, but I've explored it. It's passable. Then that's our way out, Clara decided. If we need to run, we meet at the church at midnight on the third day and head for the Carson shaft. And if some of us can't make it, Margaret asked, ever practical. Jonah pulled a small pouch from a shelf, extracting 5 carved wooden tokens, each etched with a crude hawk. Tribal trade tokens. I use them with friendly Apache bands. They know this mark as mine. He handed one to each woman. If you're separated, show this to any native you meet. Ask for Red Hawk, that's what they call me. They might guide you to me. Lillian studied her token, wide-eyed. You trade with the same Apache who tracked us. Different band, Jonah clarified. The mountains have several groups. Some trust me, others don't. It's a last resort. Clara pocketed her token, her mind already on the days ahead. We should rest. Tomorrow will demand everything we've got. I'll take first watch, Jonah said, moving to the door. The Apache know these hills. My diversion might not have thrown them off for long. After he stepped outside, the women huddled closer, their voices low. Are we really doing this? Margaret asked, her pragmatism resurfacing. Walking into a town that's killed to keep its secrets. What's the alternative? Clara countered. Trek to Fort Benton with no supplies, Abigail injured, an Apache in the canyons. Or go back to the lives we fled. Abigail adjusted her position, wincing. Clara's right. This way we choose our fight, not just survive it. And we stop this for others, Lillian added softly. For women like Rachel. Isabel's face was resolute in the firelight. I've spent my life being judged for who I am, pushed to the margins. If I'm risking it all, let it be for something that matters. Margaret sighed, outnumbered. Then we'd better plan like our lives depend on it. These men have kept their lies going for years. They won't be outsmarted easily. Through the night, they took turns keeping watch with Jonah, refining their strategy. Clara sketched a rough map of Hope's End based on Jonah's detailed ones, marking key spots: the church, the doctor's office, the assayer's records, the mine entrance, and the Carson shaft. As dawn approached, Jonah returned from his final check, finding Clara still awake, adding notes to her map by the fire's dying embers. You need sleep, he said, pouring coffee from a pot kept warm on the hearth. The road to Hope's End is hard enough without exhaustion. There's too much to plan, Clara replied, her eyes shadowed but determined. If we're going to pull this off, we need to be ready for anything. Jonah studied her, then pulled a small leather-bound book from his shirt pocket. Rachel's diary, he said, his voice rough. I took it from her house after she died. It's got her notes, suspicions, names of folks she trusted in town. He hesitated, then placed it in Clara's hands. It might help where my maps can't. Clara felt the weight of the gesture, knowing this was his last tie to his sister. We'll find the truth, she promised quietly. For Rachel and the others. Jonah nodded, his stoicism cracking for a moment, revealing raw vulnerability. Just promise you'll put your safety first. Evidence is worthless if you don't make it out. We'll be careful, Clara assured him, though they both knew the risks they were embracing. As the first light of dawn filtered through the cabin's window, they finalized their preparations. Jonah gave them what he could spare: a knife for each woman hidden in boots or dress linings, matches wrapped in oilcloth, a small compass, and enough hardtack and jerky for 2 days. Trust no one in Hope's End at first, he warned. Rachel's diary names a few who questioned the council's story, Alina Price, the seamstress, Mary Sullivan, the telegraph operator's wife, and old Tom Granger, a prospector living on the town's edge. "How do we signal progress?" Margaret asked, adjusting her bonnet. "The church," Jonah confirmed. "A hymnal left open to page 12 means all's well. Page 24 signals a major find. Page 36 is danger. Get out immediately." Abigail, supported by Isabel and Lillian, managed a faint smile. "Hymnals as code. Poetic." Jonah led them from the cabin via a hidden switchback trail, descending into the main canyon. He'd smudged their faces with dirt and torn their dresses further to sell the story of surviving the crash and wandering lost. At the final ridge overlooking the path to Hope's End, Clara studied Jonah's face, memorizing its rugged lines. In a single day, this stranger had become their unlikely protector, risking everything for women he barely knew. 3 days, she confirmed quietly. "Evidence or not, we meet at the church at midnight on the 3rd day. Carson Shaft is our exit." Jonah nodded, his expression solemn. "I'll be watching. If you ring the bell signal early, I'll stir trouble on the town's north edge to draw them away." "And if some of us don't make it?" Margaret asked, her voice steady but searching. "Those who escape take the evidence to Fort Benton," Clara said firmly. "No one goes back. The truth has to reach the law." The weight of her words settled over them, each woman facing the possibility of being left behind. Jonah broke the silence. "One last thing." Part 4, The Facade of Hope's End. In a town where smiles hide lies and every handshake feels like a trap, 5 women must play their parts perfectly, or risk becoming ghosts in a canyon that keeps its secrets. The morning sun climbed over the Wyoming peaks, casting a golden haze across the winding trail to Hope's End. Clara Thornton led the group, her boots crunching on the rocky path, Jonah Caldwell's map tucked securely in her pocket alongside Rachel's diary. Behind her, Margaret Kane and Isabel Delgado pulled the travois bearing Abigail Harper, whose face was pale but resolute despite the pain in her splinted arm. Lillian Carter brought up the rear, clutching their meager supplies, her eyes darting nervously to the canyon walls. Jonah had vanished into the gorge at dawn, promising to shadow them from a distance, close enough to hear the church bell signal if needed. The women's appearances, torn dresses, dirt-smudged faces, and disheveled hair, sold their story of surviving the Stagecoach crash and wandering lost in Rattlesnake Gorge. But beneath the facade, their minds were sharp, each rehearsing the roles they'd play in a town Jonah had warned was built on deception. Clara's heart pounded, not from fear alone but from the weight of their mission, to uncover evidence of Hope's End's crimes while pretending to be eager brides. The stakes felt heavier with every step closer to the town's gates. As they rounded a final bend, Hope's End came into view, nestled in a narrow valley where the mountains loomed like silent judges. Wooden buildings lined a single main street, their false fronts painted in optimistic reds and blues, though the paint was peeling, hinting at the town's fading glory. A church steeple rose at one end, its bell glinting in the sunlight, while the mine entrance gaped at the other, a dark maw swallowing men and dreams alike. The air carried the tang of coal smoke and the faint clink of picks, a reminder of the silver that had once promised prosperity. A shout went up as they approached, and a small crowd gathered, miners in dusty overalls, women in faded calico, a few children peering from behind skirts. Clara steadied herself, channeling the weary relief of a lost traveler. "We're the brides from the Stagecoach," she called, her voice hoarse but clear. "There was an accident in the gorge. We need help." The crowd parted, and a man in a crisp suit stepped forward, his gold watch chain catching the light. His smile was practiced, but his eyes were cold, assessing. "Harold Grayson, mine owner and head of the town council," he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "You've had quite an ordeal, ladies. Welcome to Hope's End." Clara introduced herself and the others, sticking to their rehearsed story. The crash, the driver's death, their desperate trek through the canyon. Grayson's expression remained sympathetic, but Clara caught the flicker of calculation in his gaze, as if weighing their tale against some hidden ledger. He summoned a matronly woman, Mrs. Clara Sullivan, to escort them to the boarding house for rest and medical attention. As they followed, Clara noted the townsfolk's forced cheer, their smiles tight, their whispers trailing like shadows. The boarding house was a two-story structure with creaking floors and faded wallpaper, its dining room already set for a welcome meal. Dr. Benjamin Cole, Abigail's intended, arrived to examine her arm, his hands trembling slightly, his pupils pinpricks from laudanum. "Rest tonight," he slurred, his breath sharp with whiskey. No need for the celebration after such a journey. Abigail played the part of a dazed patient, her eyes conveying to Clara that she'd already spotted filing cabinets in Cole's adjoining office, potential gold mines of death records. By evening, the women had settled into their roles, each assigned a room in the boarding house. Clara slipped into Isabel's room after dark, the others joining quietly, their movements cautious to avoid creaking floorboards. Lillian kept watch at the door, her handkerchief twisted in her hands. "Observations," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind rattling the window panes. Margaret spoke first, her tone clipped but focused. "Deacon Ellison invited me to tour the church tomorrow. He's eager to show off a new organ, funded by the mine's continued success. Sounds like a sales pitch to keep me quiet." "Daniel's sweet but jittery," Lillian said, stepping away from the door. "When I asked about our home, he said they're still building it. He's bunking with other miners, even though he's supposed to have his own claim." Isabel's face was grim, her dark eyes hard. "Caleb Vaughn wants me at the saloon tomorrow. The sheriff, Wade Carson, made it clear my job's entertaining miners, not just pouring drinks. They're not subtle about what they expect. Samuel Hayes wants me in his store first thing," Clara added, her stomach twisting at the memory of his whiskey-soaked breath. "He's ordering extra stock, banking on a big strike soon. The whole town's running on promises that don't add up." "Where's Abigail?" Margaret asked, noticing her absence. "Still playing drugged for Cole," Clara explained. But she saw filing cabinets in his office, likely medical records. "She'll stay close to him tomorrow." They spent the next hour planning their moves, each assigned to probe their respective corners of Hope's End for evidence of the fraud and murders Jonah had described. The church hymnal signal, page 12 for progress, 24 for find, 36 for danger, would keep them coordinated. 2 days left, Clara cautioned as they dispersed. "Make every moment count, but don't push too hard. We're being watched." Dawn broke over Hope's End, painting the town in a deceptively warm glow. The women scattered to their tasks. Margaret accompanied Deacon Ellison to the church, her sharp eyes scanning for anything out of place. Lillian joined miners' wives, delivering meal baskets to the dig site, her gentle demeanor coaxing gossip. Isabel, steeling herself, headed to the saloon to meet Caleb Vaughn. Abigail remained at the boarding house, feigning weakness to observe Cole's comings and goings. Clara took her place behind the counter at Hayes' General Store, serving customers while keeping an eye on the town's pulse. The store's prime location on Main Street offered a clear view of Hope's End's daily rhythm. Mid-morning, Sheriff Carson and 2 deputies rode out, likely to investigate the crash site. Clara calculated they'd be gone until the next day, given the gorge's treacherous terrain. Her chance came just before noon when Hayes, his steps unsteady from covert drinking, mumbled about checking inventory in the storeroom, a thinly veiled excuse to indulge further. As soon as the storeroom door clicked shut, Clara darted to the shelf beneath the counter, pulling out the store's account books. Her heart raced as she flipped through the pages, Jonah's warnings echoing in her mind. The records painted a dire picture. The store was drowning in debt, extending credit to minors who couldn't pay while ordering luxury goods on the promise of a coming boom. Marginal notes referenced council guarantees and investor funds due soon. Most damning were the freight logs. Hope's End hadn't shipped significant silver in over a year, only small batches to maintain the illusion of production. Clara was sliding the books back into place when the bell above the door jingled. She looked up to find Eleanor Price, the seamstress Jonah had named as a potential ally, entering with a basket of mended shirts. "Good morning, dear," Eleanor called, her cheerful tone at odds with the urgency in her eyes. "I've got Mr. Hayes' shirts." "Is he in?" "Taking inventory," Clara replied, emphasizing the word to signal Hayes' absence. Eleanor nodded, understanding. "I seem to have lost my thimble between here and the church," Eleanor said, her voice deliberately casual. "A gift from my late husband. Could you help me look?" "Won't take long." The excuse was flimsy, but Clara seized it. After informing Hayes, who grunted from the storeroom, she followed Eleanor outside. Instead of searching the ground, the older woman led her swiftly to a small house off the main road. Once inside, with the door bolted, Eleanor's demeanor shifted to one of quiet intensity. "We don't have much time," she said. "You're not the first brides to arrive with questions in your eyes." Rachel Vaughn had the same look. "You knew Rachel?" Clara asked, instantly alert. "Like a daughter," Eleanor said, her voice catching. "And she didn't fall down any mineshaft. She was pushed after she uncovered the truth." "What truth?" Clara pressed, her pulse quickening. "The mine's been dry for nearly 2 years. What little silver they pull out barely covers costs. The council's been fleecing Boston investors with fake reports, pocketing the money." Eleanor pried up a floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. "Rachel gave me these the day before she died." She handed Clara a packet of papers, mine production reports with 2 sets of figures, one far lower than the other, alongside telegrams boasting false yields to investors. "Why not take these to the authorities?" Clara asked, scanning the documents. "An old woman traveling alone through Apache territory." Eleanor shook her head. "Besides, the council watches everyone. No one leaves without their say-so." She fixed Clara with a piercing stare. "But you're planning something, aren't you? You and the other brides." Clara hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "We've heard things from Jonah Caldwell," she admitted. "He's been watching the town." Eleanor's face softened. "Good. Rachel's brother deserves to know she didn't die for nothing." She pressed the papers into Clara's hands. "Take these. Add them to whatever you find. But tonight's welcome celebration is a test. The council will be watching to see if you buy their story or ask questions like Rachel did." "How did you know we're not what we seem?" Clara asked, tucking the papers into her dress. 5 women surviving a gorge crash, finding their way here without the confusion of days lost." Eleanor's smile was knowing. "I've seen enough of this town to spot a spark of defiance. Now we should get back before Hayes notices you're gone." They returned to the store, Eleanor chattering about dress alterations to maintain the ruse. Clara's mind raced, the weight of Eleanor's evidence burning against her chest. Throughout the day, the others made progress. Margaret reported from the church, where she'd set the hymnal to page 12, signaling all was well. She'd also found marriage and death records, some with suspiciously vague causes. Lillian, at the mine, overheard miners grumbling about barren dig sites and forced false reports, a few muttering about leaving before winter. Only Isabel faced immediate trouble. When she slipped away from the saloon, her face was taut with controlled anger. "Vaughn expects me to start entertaining tonight after the celebration," she whispered to Clara near the boarding house. He wasn't shy about what that means. Her hand brushed her pocket, where Clara knew she kept Jonah's vial of ipecac, a last resort for distraction. "Did you find anything?" "The saloon's where the real deals happen," Isabel said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Vaughn keeps the council's private books in a safe in his office. I saw him checking them with Carson and a man they called the company agent. They mentioned a final shipment next week and shutting down by month's end. They're planning to abandon Hope's End." Clara's blood ran cold. "Once they've squeezed out the last investor money. And the townsfolk." "Nothing good," Isabel said grimly. "We need those books." Their conversation was cut short as Alina approached, ostensibly to discuss celebration attire. As she adjusted Clara's collar, she whispered, "Abigail needs you." "Cole's with her." Clara hurried to the boarding house, finding Abigail rigid on her bed while Dr. Cole examined her splint. His movements were erratic, his eyes bloodshot. "Miss Thornton," he greeted, his words slurring. "I was telling Miss Harper she should skip the celebration. Her condition's delicate." Abigail's gaze locked with Clara's, silently signaling suspicion. "I agree, doctor," Clara said smoothly. "I'll stay with her. After the gorge, I'm not up for festivities either." Cole's frown deepened, his tone sharpening. "The town's gone to great effort to welcome you. Your absence would raise eyebrows," the threat was clear. "Perhaps a brief appearance, then early rest with your approval," Clara backtracked, keeping her voice deferential. Satisfied, Cole left. Abigail dropped her drugged act instantly. "He's been prying about the crash, specifics on the gorge, the wreckage, how we survived. When I played confused, he got cagey." "Anything on the search party?" Clara asked, lowering her voice. "Not back yet, but Cole said Carson's worried about inconsistencies between our story and Nate's." Abigail leaned closer. "I glimpsed a telegram in his bag, something about complications and an accelerated timeline." Clara shared Alina's evidence and Isabel's discovery. "They're planning to pull out soon. Tonight's celebration could be more dangerous than we thought." "Should we signal Jonah for extraction?" Abigail asked, her voice steady despite her pain. Clara weighed their options. "Alina's papers are strong, but we need Vaughn's books to nail the fraud and murders. If we leave now, we save ourselves but doom the next women they lure here, and the townsfolk left behind." Abigail nodded, her expression grim. "If they abandon the mine, everyone here's collateral damage." They prepared for the evening, dressing carefully, concealing Jonah's tokens and knives in their clothing. Isabel carried the ipecac, her role at the saloon carrying the most immediate risk. Alina arrived to escort them to the church hall, the main street now aglow with lanterns and bunting, a festive mask over Hope's End's rotting core. Townsfolk greeted them warmly, but Clara sensed tension beneath their smiles, eyes that lingered too long. The church hall buzzed with activity, tables groaning with food, fiddlers playing lively tunes, miners and merchants in their best clothes, eager to impress. On a raised platform sat the council, Grayson, the mine owner, Edward Langley, the banker, and Hayes, Vaughn, and Ellison, their intended husbands. Grayson's polished demeanor barely hid his nervous scanning of the crowd. When his eyes met the bride's, a cold calculation flickered before his smile returned. The celebration unfolded with strained formality, speeches touting Hope's End's bright future, introductions to key residents, awkward small talk. Clara stayed vigilant, noting who seemed genuine versus those watching with suspicion. As the formalities ended and dancing began, the women split up to gather final intelligence. Margaret engaged Ellison on church finances, Lillian mingled with miners' wives, and Abigail, playing invalid, sat near the council's table, eavesdropping. Clara found herself cornered by Hayes, whose drinking made him overly familiar, his hands brushing her arm as he rambled about an investor visit and a special shipment. She endured it, extracting details while dodging his advances. Isabel faced the greatest challenge. Caleb Vaughn, impatient with the public event, insisted she return to the saloon to begin her real work. Clara watched, heart pounding, as Isabel executed their contingency plan, spilling wine on Vaughn's shirt and offering to fetch water. Instead, she signaled Clara with a quick gesture and slipped out a side door. Their rendezvous was the church cemetery, a shadowed corner offering privacy. Clara excused herself from Hayes and followed minutes later, finding Isabel waiting among the weathered gravestones. "Vaughn expects me in his room in 20 minutes, Isabel said urgently. "I can't dodge it without tipping them off, but it gets me into his office, maybe the safe." "It's too dangerous," Clara protested, the night air chilling her skin. "I slipped Ipecac into his whiskey," Isabel said, her voice steady. "He'll be distracted soon. I'll have time to search." Before Clara could argue, a rustling in the nearby brush froze them. They fell silent, years of caution kicking in. The sound came again, followed by a low whistle, Jonah's signal. Clara's breath caught as he emerged from the shadows, his face grim. "The search party found the crash site," he said, his voice low. "They know your story doesn't add up. I overheard them reporting to a council member on the trail." "How'd you get into town unseen?" Isabel demanded. "Underground," Jonah said, gesturing toward the cemetery's edge. "The Carson shaft has a ventilation tunnel that opens near here. I've been watching the celebration through the church windows." Clara quickly shared their findings, Aliner's papers, the council's plan to abandon Hope's End, Vaughn's books. Jonah's expression darkened with each revelation. "They're not just running a fraud, they're planning to vanish. And they don't leave witnesses." "We should go now," Isabel urged. "Aliner's evidence might be enough." "Not without the books," Jonah said. "They'd have direct proof of embezzlement, names of everyone involved. Without them, the authorities might call it a failed business, not murder." "Then I search Vaughn's office," Isabel decided. "While he's indisposed." "I'm coming with you," Jonah said. "I know the saloon's layout from when I lived here. There's a back entrance through the storeroom." "And us?" Clara asked, her mind racing. "Keep up the act for now," Jonah said, "but be ready to run. If Isabel gets the books or if things go south, meet at the church at midnight, tonight, not tomorrow." He handed Clara a rusted key. "This opens the vestry door. Rachel used it for church duties." As they prepared to split up, a voice from the darkness stopped them cold. "I figured I'd find a secret meeting tonight," Sheriff Wade Carson said, stepping into view, his revolver gleaming in the moonlight. "But I didn't expect a ghost, Caldwell. Hope's End's been quieter without you." Conclusion: the light beyond the gorge. When the truth is all you have left, will it be enough to outrun the shadows of a town built on blood? The moon hung low over Hope's End, its silver light glinting off Sheriff Wade Carson's revolver as he faced Jonah Caldwell, Clara Thornton, and Isabel Delgado in the church cemetery. The distant fiddle music from the celebration masked the tension, But Clara's heart pounded as Carson's cold smile promised no mercy. "Step away from Caldwell, ladies," he ordered. "His lies about his sister's accident don't change your contracts." Clara and Isabel stood firm, their defiance fueling Carson's anger. He accused Jonah of delusional paranoia, claiming he'd been institutionalized after Rachel's death, a half-truth Jonah countered with quiet fury, exposing the council's role in silencing him. The standoff broke when Deacon Ellison's voice called from the church gate, distracting Carson. Jonah lunged, wrestling the sheriff's gun skyward as it fired, the shot echoing through the night. "Run!" Jonah shouted, grappling with Carson as Ellison raised the alarm. Clara pulled Isabel into the shadows, her mind racing. Jonah's sacrifice gave them a chance, but at a cost. They raced to the boarding house, finding Margaret Kane, Lillian Carter, and Abigail Harper already packing, the gunshot their signal to flee. Clara explained in clipped words. Jonah captured, Carson suspicious, their cover blown. They needed the council's books from Caleb Vaughn's saloon, and an immediate escape through the Carson mineshaft. Alina Price slipped in, her face taut with urgency, handing Clara a ring of keys, including one for the jail. "The town's in chaos," she whispered. "Jonah's in the jail, and the council's meeting at the saloon." "Move fast," Clara decided. She and Isabel would target the books, while Margaret, Lillian, and Abigail headed to the church with Alina's evidence, Rachel's papers proving the mine's fraud. Under cover of a sudden rain, Clara and Isabel reached the saloon's back entrance, using Alina's key. Inside, the council argued over papers and whiskey, distracted by a staged boarding house fire, Alina's doing. Isabel worked the safe's combination right 25, left 10, right 16, retrieving ledgers detailing embezzlement and a chilling list of obstacles removed, including Rachel's murder. As they fled, Vaughn stumbled in, drunk and oblivious, allowing their escape into the storm. At the church, Margaret's group waited, hymnal set to page 24 signaling their success. But shouts neared. The council had realized the books were gone. Clara sent Margaret, Lillian, and Abigail into the mineshaft, its damp tunnels their only hope. She and Isabel stayed to delay pursuit, extinguishing candles and knocking over pews to sow confusion. Carson and his men stormed in, chasing Clara's deliberate diversion toward the mine entrance, away from the shaft. Clara was caught, dragged to the jail where Jonah sat bruised but unbroken. The council, Grayson, Langley, Vaughn, Ellison, and Hayes, raged over the missing ledgers and Alina's disappearance. They planned to flood the shaft, trapping the others, and stage an accident for Clara and Jonah. But Jonah whispered hope. His Apache allies might aid the fleeing women if they showed his hawk tokens. Deep in the Carson shaft, Margaret led Lillian and Abigail, the ledgers clutched tight as water rose behind them. They squeezed through a collapsed exit, emerging into pre-dawn light, only to face a council search party. A native woman, recognizing Jonah's tokens, guided them up a hidden cliff path to safety, promising to deliver them to Chief Blackhawk's camp. In the jail, Isabel, who'd evaded capture by hiding in the church bell tower, staged a daring rescue. Using Alina's keys, she subdued the deputies and freed Clara and Jonah. They retrieved copies of Rachel's letters from the tower, insurance Alina had hidden, and stole horses from the livery, riding north through secret canyon trails. By midday they reached Blackhawk's camp, reuniting with Margaret, Lillian, and Abigail, who'd been sheltered by the Apache. The ledgers and letters, damning proof of fraud, murder, and embezzlement, were safe. With Blackhawk's escort, the group reached Fort Benton, where Clara presented the evidence to territorial authorities. The governor, unable to ignore the documented crimes, launched an investigation. Hope's End's council faced trials, their secrets laid bare. The town's miners and families, freed from the deception, chose their own paths, some staying to rebuild, others scattering to new horizons. As Clara stood on Fort Benton's edge, gazing toward Rattlesnake Gorge, Jonah joined her, his weathered face softened by purpose. "Rachel's justice is done," he said quietly. "Maybe now I can build something, like she always wanted." Clara looked at her companions, Margaret's pragmatism, Abigail's resilience, Lillian's courage, Isabel's defiance, now her family. The Stagecoach crash had been no accident of fate, but a crucible forging them into something stronger. "We didn't find the marriages we were promised," she said, a faint smile breaking through. "We found ourselves." The sun rose higher, illuminating the paths they'd taken and those yet to come. Hope's End faded into memory, its lies buried in the canyon's shadows, while ahead lay a future carved by 5 women who dared to uncover the truth.